So I want to talk about the most important relationship when it comes to Overlord, and this is truly the most important relationship because I believe it was a relationship that was meant to blossom. I say with absolute sarcasm, and I'm sure I'll get someone angry in the comments, which is of course the relationship between Philip and Albedo. But joking aside is that I do actually believe this relationship was meant to go somewhere different based on the author's initial plans, and I'm going to go into why I actually think this relationship was meant to pivot a little bit different than how the light novels ended up doing things in volume 14. And it's not that they actually got together or anything like that, but more of an attempt to get together, and it more was one-sided. So for all those that have watched Season 4 or read Volume 14, Philip, of course, had a deep obsession with Albedo. He fell in love with her. He was going to try and marry her, but he decided to attack a grain cart and ended up provoking the wrath of Ainz and Nazarick, and ended up getting a lot of people killed in the process, and he ended up getting tortured by Albedo, learning new torture techniques. Now, I do believe the ending was always going to be the same in the sense of Albedo would end up taking him into Nazarick and end up torturing him personally, because I think there's something poetic about it, especially with Philip's obsession towards Albedo. But I don't believe the events in Volume 14 were the initial plans. And to kind of point back to some of the other times that I've spoken is about the fact that the author did intend to go beyond the initial plans of volumes. Now, back when volume 14 came out, he only planned to go to volume 17, and then in the more recent volumes he's extended that by one, only because the new recent volume was split into two parts because of how big it was. So just some context there. Now, we can theorize how many volumes the author was always intending to do. Some people have theorized 50, some have theorized 30, some have theorized 24, 25. I think personally myself it would have been around 30, give or take. I think that's the sweet spot of where and how far he would have gone, and he has mentioned that he had ideas for well beyond that. But I do believe that the story with Philip and everything evolving around him was meant to be more than just a couple volumes that ended up playing out in volume 14, and the reason being is because of his obsession with Albedo. He was in love, he was infatuated. Now, it's not the first time that mere mortals have fell in love with NPCs from Nazarick. I mean, we just look at a particular maid that worked with Momon during the adventures. A lot of people did fall in love with her and tried to blackmail her or try to persuade her or try to woo her, and all of those ended up failing. So it's not the first time. Narble, again, being that major centerpiece in the early stages, Albedo did capture a lot of eyes, and of course she's a succubus, so her aesthetics and all that are definitely going to appease to a lot of people. But Philip was very, very obsessed, and he had this ego complex where he thought that he was going to get with Albedo and that he was going to overthrow Nazarick and Ainz and somehow win his way to her heart. We all know how stupid Philip is. That is no debate right there. As someone, I mean, you could argue that he was a true genius just out of a bit of mockery, but I mean, his overall ambitions were just quite a mouthful to take in, to say the least. But I do believe that one of the initial plans for the light novels, and again, you don't have to agree with me, was that he was going to try and pull a political marriage. And during Volume 13, Ainz was just coming back from the Holy Kingdom arc at the end of Volume 13 because of everything played out in those two volumes, and there was meant to be a volume or so dedicated towards the Draconic Kingdom, and I believe as other volumes were playing out, there was going to probably be other little mini chapters or just little pockets of parts of the story that help add more context to overall Philip's ambitions on trying to gain power. And because of everything Ainz has done at the Cats of Plains, it would have given Philip an opportunity to slowly work his way up on the food chain, and that was what Nazarick wanted. They wanted Philip to go up on the ladder of influence and power so that when he does something truly stupid, it would have a better justification. Now you can say, oh well, they had a good justification in Volume 14, but personally myself, and I know this might trigger some Overlord fans, again, I love the series, but I'm going to be critical where I feel it's fair. I do feel like the justification for that was kind of weak, especially when you look at previous volumes where certain people have invaded the tomb, and the easy solution to that was just chop off the head of the person that sent them there, even though Nazarick or Ainz was part of all that plan with Demiurge. I do feel like an easy solution would have been just, hey, here's Philip's head and that's the end of it, and then they could have forced them into a lot more of a backwards deal of them being basically a vassal state. But again, you don't have to agree with that, of how that could have played out. But Riv Philip attacking the Grand Cart, I do also wonder why other people condoned the idea, because he got a lot of people behind him to go Riv the idea. And with everything that played out in Cats of Plains, yes, I can understand why Philip was so blindsided, because he was very egotistic, narcissistic, and he was just trying to grab any power he could, and was very conspiracy theory based, of being like, oh, well, it was all conspiracy, what happened in the Cats of Plains. But I don't believe everyone else around him was that stupid. But for some reason in the light novels, they kind of made it that everyone just went along with it and kind of just went with his plan of attacking the Grand Cart. In my opinion, I don't think everyone was that stupid. I think there would have been some people that should have at least been a little bit more wary. So I feel like that storyline, it does and it doesn't make sense in certain degrees depending on how you want to look at it. But I do believe that while other stories were playing out with Ainz, he would come back to this situation of Philip slowly gaining power as wanted by Nazarick and those planning everything out, that Philip would gain power and then he would push for something or do something stupid, and then there would be a justification. But what would end up happening is he would end up doing something really stupid, and that was try to push for a political marriage with Albedo. And then Albedo would have been absolute furious, would have been even more hilarious, because no one's allowed to touch Albedo, and Philip trying to get even more close to her would have triggered her even more. And that ending that ended up happening in Volume 14, to me, would have felt even more satisfying, especially if we got to see, maybe, or at least hear some of the screams, say like in the anime perspective, but from the light novel perspective, kind of play out some of the torture that went on. Kind of you look at the invasion of the tomb, how some of that was described. And that's where Ainz would have had to come up with a creative way to navigate around that political issue. Because that's the fun part about Overlord, is Ainz trying to navigate around weird political issues that end up going wrong, but then end up seeming like it was all part of his grand plan. And that's where it would have looked like Philip was doing something really stupid, but then all the other denizens would have been like, oh my god, Ainz planned this all along, that he would chase Albedo and Ainz would come in and swoop to save the day, and it would have fed into Albedo's fantasy as well, because Albedo has this obsession with Ainz and wanting to be with him and having his children and all that, and it would have fed into that constant comedic fantasy of Ainz coming to save the day to stop Philip. At least that's the way I see it. I see it from a political, theatrical component. It's my favorite word for the week, or sentence. And then also the comedy aspect of Ainz having to navigate around it, but also just really ticking Albedo off, that Philip even thought he could even have his way with her. And then also having Renee play a part in that as well, and her being a bigger, more pivotal role in that overarching story of trying to play around with it. But I think because of how complex that story would have been, it would have taken a multitude of chapters and volumes to play out, which is why the author just decided maybe not to do that. This is just my theory, this is my headcanon, you don't have to agree with me because it is pretty far out there. But that's what I always thought was going to happen when reading the light novels back then, because I always saw Philip that deeply obsessed with Albedo that he would have done something like that. Because if you go back to the early stages of when he first met Albedo, he was determined to marry her. And even though another person that was playing along with this whole ruse was like, oh, no, don't do that, it was something that he was deeply ingrained to follow through, but instead went with the whole grain idea. Even though with the grain idea, he kind of had this idea that he would masterfully beat Ainz and then take Albedo, but it's just kind of like, the stupidity in that is pretty insane. But again, Philip is Philip. He is pretty wonkos and insane, so how things played out in Volume 14 isn't bad. I just personally wondered in myself, was there something much more grander and much more bigger in play? But the actual end result, or the destination, was what was always destined for him to happen, which was being tortured by Albedo. And something a little bit more poetic, especially when he chases her so heavily. He does get that ending with her, but just not the happy ending that he so dreamed and desired. So I'd love to know your thoughts in the comment section down below. What do you think would have played out if the author did intend to add more volumes to it? Would have it ended in the same way, but a little bit more of a longer scale to it, or would have it played out very differently and a bit more of a political puppeteering going on, which personally I would have liked personally, because I really like Renaer. I've mentioned that in my previous videos, and seeing Renaer play more of a role would have been much more funner, because to be honest, when it comes to Renaer as well, is I do believe there was a lot more planned for her as well, but because of how Volume 14 went, they ended up cutting a lot of the initial plans for her as well and just cut it dry. So I think there was a lot more plans for other characters like Renaer, Climb, Philip, also another swords person that's off the tip of my tongue. And so all of those kind of, I feel like were a lot more long scale plans. So again, love to know your thoughts, but of course, if you like this video, hit the like button, subscribe for more anime content, and I'll see you beautiful nerds in the next video.